So one of the driving forces in sort of all of these big things that we study in history, whether it's capitalism or industrialization or war, are resources. That's what colonialism is about. It's about powerful countries determining that they're going to stay in power by extracting resources from the colonies. And so what's endemic in all of this is a power struggle. It means that the metropoles, the main sort of cities and the main countries have control over the resources from the countries in which these resources originate. So the British controlled the oil resources of Iran. And that was extremely important to sort of helping to fuel the British Empire in one way. When in 1950, Mohammad Mossadegh came to power as the prime minister of Iran, he was the first third world leader to nationalize resources. So this was a huge move in the sense that he said, it makes no sense for our country to have all of these resources that other countries are becoming rich off of, and we get basically pennies in return. So that was one of the things that made him very popular within the country, is that in some ways he spoke truth to power, and he was willing to take the risk and to stand up to these powerful foreign countries. So he nationalized the oil in 1950 and basically kicked the British out. And the British had by that point a very long history of dominating the oil in the south of Iran. But that's very much the reason why Mossadegh was such a powerful and such a popular leader in Iran. Once he kicked the British out, the British thought that they needed to do something in order to get back in and in order to be able to have control over oil again. Because if you don't have control over resources like that, it's very difficult for you to maintain your empire. And so they began to try to convince the Americans, Eisenhower at the time, that Mohammad Mossadegh is a communist. And if we remember at that time, one of the biggest things that was happening was the Soviet Union versus the United States and the beginning of the Cold War. So this fight sort of fell into that rhetoric of the Cold War. And Iran is very close to Russia geographically. So this was important. Finally, the British were able to convince the Americans that this is what was happening, even though on the ground that's actually not what was going on. And so the CIA and the MI6, the British intelligence agency, created a coup in Iran in 1953. So it removed that prime minister and it reinstated the Shah. This became a huge moment in Iranian history and U.S.-Iran relations because many Iranians felt that the United States intervened in its domestic politics and took away someone who many people felt was doing the right thing for Iran and then instead instated a dictator. And then once the coup happened, both British and American oil companies got, again, very favorable contracts over the oil in Iran.
One of his rare appearances, Mohammad Mossadegh, Premier of Iran, meets the press to reaffirm his government's unwillingness to arbitrate with Britain over nationalizing the Anglo-Iranian oil company. With chances of a settlement fading, the West's best hope is that this sickly man, in whose frail hands may lie the key to peace, is as anti-Russian as he is anti-British.
There was a densely packed session of the Security Council at New York when Persia's ailing premier, Dr. Mossadegh, arrived on the arm of Mr. Trygve Lie, the United Nations Secretary. Shaky on his pins, but firm enough in his policy, he was opposed by Britain's Sir Gladwin Jebb. Dr. Mossadegh, speaking in French, reiterated the Persian attitude to the oil dispute. Sir Gladwin asked Dr. Mossadegh
not to brood unduly on old imagined wrongs, but to concentrate on the broader aspects, and to show by his attitude that he too welcomes a constructive solution, which, as I think I said in my initial speech, will enable us to achieve some synthesis between the industrialized West and the as yet only partially industrialized nations of the immemorial East that will redound to the benefit of the world as a whole.
Of course, there are none so deaf as those who won't hear. The men below give the word, and the rest is easy. In the military court at Tehran, where he's been on trial for treason, the Persian ex-premier, Dr. Mossadegh, demonstrates that he knows how to make an entrance. Clad in his accustomed dressing gown and pajamas, he even makes a dramatic scene out of taking his place in the dock. From this picture, you might conclude that he's a dying man, or at any rate a very sick one. At other times, however, the tribunal has been kept in an uproar, for the aged defendant has constantly challenged the authority of the court to try him. And he's hurled insults at everyone, including the officer appointed to defend him. What a performance!
It's actually been an open secret for decades, but for the first time now, the CIA has released documents that show its role in the 1953 coup. That is the coup that toppled Iran's democratically elected Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, had moved to nationalize oil production in Iran. Well, the U.S. was concerned at the time that that would mean a victory for the Soviets in the Cold War. So shortly after his election, the CIA began to plan his overthrow, teaming up with Britain's MI6.
Now, the CIA, we've seen it spelling out its involvement in a series of newly declassified documents. These are the actual documents marked confidential, top secret, eyes only. It's the stuff of crime and mystery and spy novels. This one talks about the security implications of CIA letters of commendation for those who served in that operation codenamed TP Ajax. And this one, dated July 22nd, 1953, almost a month before the coup, it talks about preparing an official American statement to follow a successful coup. So let's dig deeper into this story. We're joined now by Middle East analyst Robin Wright. She's in from Washington. Robin, this is an event that the Iranians still talk about 60 years later with surprising frequency. What have you learned from these documents that you got to get a look at?
Well, I've written about this episode in 3 different books, so this is, as you point out, not something new, but the fact is the United States has finally openly provided the documents and details. And it talks about how this was approved at the highest levels of government. It details the amount of money that went into buying, currying favor among the various sectors of Iranian society. And it points out how important this really was. Little did the CIA understand that this would have extraordinary repercussions 25 years later.
And, you know, one of the things that's fascinating is, like, it is an open secret. This is something that we've heard from former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, President Obama as well, both of them referring to this as this cooperation that happened. But the first time that the CIA has really acknowledged its role in this, do you think there's going to be any kind of shift or a change or a way that the new president of Iran, Hassan Rouhani, can open up a new dialogue with the United States?
Well, the release of these documents were as a result of a Freedom of Information inquiry. So this was not something that the United States voluntarily provided, but it does come at a very curious or interesting time because Iran has a new president who's talked about moderation and trying to engage in really serious dialogue with the outside world, the world's 6 major powers, and even hinted at direct talks with the United States. And it's very interesting how this release of documents is playing in Tehran. The fact that the United States has acknowledged it openly, put it out there on the table, may actually help both sides get beyond it. The United States has formally apologized for it in the past, but in vague terms. Now the details are known, and kind of fessing up may change the atmospherics at least.
And Robin, you know, this case perhaps explains to some Americans, to some of us, why in the Middle East, in countries like Iran, some of the public opinion is so mixed and negative, really, when it comes to the U.S. We're still feeling the after effects of that coup, which was carried out at the height of the Cold War, to this very day, right?
Absolutely, and it did lead to the abortion of the evolutionary political process led to a revolutionary process 25 years later, for which the United States is still trying to recoup. Iran had been one of the two pillars of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, and this was a tremendous loss, not just because it's an oil-producing country. It has very valuable geostrategic consequences, and this is a moment that turned everything, two very close allies against each other, and this is a moment that these documents kind of illustrate the consequences of opting for stability over democratic values, which resonates in terms of what's happening in Egypt, Syria, and elsewhere in the Middle East today.
It has a regional impact. Robin, thank you so much. I really appreciate that.
The United States has taken the to people.
Ever since the revolution of 1979, US presidents have viewed the Islamic Republic of Iran, under the rule of the Ayatollahs, as a threat and as an enemy, and the feeling's pretty mutual.
Iran's leaders have shown only a clenched fist.
آمریکا و انگلیس رو نگاه بکنید. هر جا دیکتاتوری و ترور و آدمکشی است، دست اونها در کاره.
For decades, Iran has fueled the fires of sectarian conflict and terror.
Death to America, Khamenei told the audience, because America is the original source of this pressure.
But what if it was blowback from US policies that helped the Ayatollahs take over in the first place? Americans often ask, why can't Iran have a secular democratic government? Well, they kinda did, and it was the US that helped get rid of that government and paved the way for the Ayatollahs and the Islamic Revolution. You have to go back to 1953 and the coup against Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, who was democratically elected. A former Time magazine Man of the Year, the populist Mossadegh had a great deal of support from ordinary Iranians. He reduced the powers of the autocratic king, the Shah, and nationalized the Iranian oil industry. That upset the British, who had been in control of Iran's oil, and they decided to take action.
We should not allow the biggest foreign asset in Britain to go without doing something about it.
The sooner then that he left power, the better for Persia. Not for us, for Persia.
Right. So the British persuaded the Americans, in the form of the Eisenhower administration, to join them in getting rid of Mossadegh.
The British understood the extent of paranoia in this country concerning communism. This was the day of Joe McCarthy, and that the British consciously played on that fear in order to help persuade us to involve ourselves in the coup.
Mossadegh was not a communist, but he did have the support of the country's Communist Party. So the CIA, just 6 years old, swung into action. CIA agent Kermit Roosevelt, grandson of President Theodore Roosevelt, arrived in Tehran in July of 1953 to implement Operation Ajax. Thanks to declassified CIA documents, we now know the details of that plan included persuading the Shah to sign 2 decrees sacking Mossadegh and replacing him with a pro-American general, paying mobs of protesters to take to the streets and start anti-government riots, and funding a propaganda campaign to portray Mossadegh as a pro-Soviet communist.
That mob that came into North Tehran and was decisive in the overthrow was a mercenary mob, had no ideology, and that mob was paid for by American dollars.
By August, Mossadegh had been forced from office and the Shah was back in full control. I owe my throne to God, my people, my army, and to you, the jubilant Shah told Roosevelt and the CIA, as he kicked off a 26-year period of brutal dictatorship, which would end up sparking the Islamic Revolution in 1979. By the way, none of this is disputed anymore. The Clinton administration fessed up in 2000.
The Eisenhower administration believed its actions were justified for strategic reasons, but the coup was clearly a setback for Iran's political development.
But even when US leaders openly admit to the US role in the Iranian coup, they try and play it down. Here's Barack Obama speaking in 2015.
We had some involvement with overthrowing a democratically elected regime in Iran.
Some involvement? Some involvement? Seriously? It may have been a British idea, but the coup itself was instigated, organized, executed, and financed by the CIA. And here's a key point, a bit a lot of people seem to be unaware of. Declassified documents seem to suggest the CIA also worked with hardline members of Iran's Shia clergy, including Mossadegh's one-time ally, Ayatollah Abul Qasim Kashani, the Speaker of Parliament, and they worked with him to help bring down that secular democratic government and bring back the Shah. See, a lot of Shia clerics back then weren't happy about Mossadegh's alliance with the communists, or his generally secular outlook, and so both the CIA and Britain's MI6 offered to fund those clerics, including the powerful and influential Ayatollah Kashani. Ayatollah Kashani was a mentor to Ayatollah Khomeini, yes, the same Khomeini who would later topple the despised Shah and found the theocratic and anti-American Islamic Republic of Iran in 1979.
Mossadegh back in 1953. Nobody knows who Mossadegh was. Democratically elected Prime Minister of Iran. He was overthrown by British and American interest because he threatened oil interest of the British. And as a result of that, the Shah of Iran came in, terrible dictator. As a result of that, you had the Iranian Revolution coming in, and that's where we are today. Unintended consequences.
Unintended consequences, or what's known in the intelligence business as blowback. In fact, the very concept of, the very term blowback, was first coined by the CIA in relation to Iran in a secret internal report on lessons learned from the coup against Mossadegh. A coup, remember, that backfired and yet nevertheless became a model for later CIA interventions from Guatemala to Chile. And whether it's coups, assassinations, invasions, more than 60 years later, the US is still in the regime change business with all of the attendant chaos, extremism, bloodshed, and blowback. I mean, the current US administration is talking about regime change in Iran. Again.
Our policy towards Iran is to push back on this hegemony, contain their ability to develop, obviously, nuclear weapons, and to work towards support of those elements inside of Iran that would lead to a peaceful transition of that government.
Are you kidding me? As Michael Morell, a former deputy director of the CIA, has pointed out, not only are you unlikely to be successful, but you're likely to have huge blowback. Yes, blowback. But is anyone in government even listening?